"You don't belong on that bench," Officer Derek Vance declared, forcefully pushing Judge Elias Thorne in open court. But that aggressive act instantly marked the irreversible downfall of a career built on deceit and abuse of power. This wasn't merely in confrontation with a black judge. It was the moment someone finally crossed an unforgivable line before the wrong eyes. Vance had no inkling the man he had just accosted was quietly unearthing records that certain individuals desperately wished to keep hidden forever, including proof about a past incident that shattered lives and reputations. What began as a routine juvenile hearing became the catalyst that would spark a federal inquiry, exposing corruption at the highest echelons. Stay tuned until the end, because this time, when the system attempted to shield its own, the entire edifice crumbled, and what followed transformed everything for those who believed they were untouchable. The fluorescent lights hummed softly in Courtroom 3C of the Sterling County Juvenile Court, casting stark shadows across the polished wooden benches where families gathered, seeking protection for their most vulnerable. The morning docket appeared unremarkable at first glance. A 15-year-old boy named Lena Hayes accused of disorderly conduct and resisting an officer. The charge, phrased in cold, official language, described a youth who had allegedly failed to comply with verbal commands and displayed a challenging demeanor. Judge Elias Thorne adjusted his spectacles as he reviewed the case file, his experienced fingers tracing lines of text that felt disturbingly familiar. 28 years on the bench, the last 15 in juvenile court, had taught him to discern the unspoken truths in police reports, where the gaps between words often held more reality than the printed statements. This wasn't his first case involving Officer Derek Vance, and the pattern emerging from the pages made his jaw clench almost imperceptibly. Lena sat in the front row, his slender frame appearing small in the oversized chair, hands clasped tightly in his lap as if attempting to vanish. His mother, Clara Hayes, kept one protective arm around her son's shoulders while clutching a worn folder with her free hand. The folder contained school commendations, character references, and medical documentation of Lena's autism spectrum. Disorder evidence of a child who had never been in trouble, whose greatest misstep was existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. The courtroom door swung open with deliberate force, the brass handle striking the wall with a sound that demanded immediate attention. Officer Derek Vance entered like a performer stepping onto his own stage. His patrol uniform pressed to military perfection, the leather of his duty belt creaking with each measured stride. At 6'4" inches, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, Vance carried himself with the unconscious confidence of someone who had never been denied by anyone who mattered. His piercing blue eyes swept the courtroom with practiced scrutiny, lingering on Lena with the cold assessment of a superior evaluating a subordinate. When his gaze shifted to Judge Thorne, something flickered across his expression. Not quite disrespect, not yet, but the kind of subtle challenge that spoke volumes about what he truly thought of the black man in robes who dared to question his judgment. "Your Honor," Vance said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. He didn't wait for permission to speak, didn't acknowledge the court's protocols with even perfunctory respect. The individual displayed clear signs of opposition during the interaction. In my professional experience, that kind of defiant posture is often a precursor to active resistance. Judge Thorne looked up from the file, his dark eyes meeting Vance's pale ones with steady composure. "Officer Vance, you're referring to a 15-year-old boy who weighs 110 pounds. Could you please specify what oppositional actions you observed?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Vance's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the mask of professional courtesy slipped just enough to reveal something unpleasant. Underneath, he refused to put down his phone when I told him to. In my line of work, we can't afford to wait for non-compliance to escalate into something more serious." And what, specifically, did this non-compliance look like? Judge Thorne's voice remained level, but those familiar with his courtroom could detect the sharpening edge beneath the calm surface. Vance shifted his weight, the leather of his gear squeaking softly in the silence. The way he held his phone up, the refusal to immediately comply when given a lawful order, these are all indicators we're trained to recognize. In the gallery, Clara Hayes felt her son's body tense against her arm. This wasn't the first time they had heard these accusations, but hearing them spoken aloud in this formal space felt like watching justice itself being exposed and demeaned. Judge Thorne made a note in his file, the scratch of his pen unnaturally loud in the tense silence. He had seen this dance before, heard these same justifications dressed up in the language of officer safety and professional training. But something about this case felt different, more personal, as if Vance wasn't just defending his actions, but challenging the very right of a black judge to question a white officer's word. The first warning sign wasn't what Vance said. It was how he said it, with the casual confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences for his choices. Elias Thorne had never intended to become a juvenile court judge. Fresh out of law school 30 years ago, he had imagined himself in criminal court, prosecuting the kinds of dramatic cases that made headlines and built reputations. The life had taught him that the most important battles were often fought in quiet rooms over custody decisions and protection orders, where the stakes measured not in years of imprisonment but in the safety of children who had no voice of their own. His own childhood in the Northwood District had given him an education that no law school could provide. He remembered being 12 years old, watching his mother navigate the court system alone, trying to get a restraining order against his father, while social workers, who looked nothing like them, made decisions about where he and his sister would sleep. That night, the memory of feeling invisible in rooms full of people who were supposed to protect him had shaped every decision he'd made since. The juvenile court appointment had come after 15 years as a prosecutor, where he had earned a reputation for being thorough, fair, and impossible to intimidate. Defense attorneys respected him because he never brought weak cases to trial. Prosecutors trusted him because he didn't play politics with people's lives. But it was the victims' families who had changed him, who had taught him that justice wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was simply about being heard by someone who cared enough to listen. His office walls told the story of that evolution. No diplomas or awards, just drawings from children he had helped remove from dangerous situations. Thank you letters from mothers who had escaped difficult relationships, and a single photo of his own family, his wife of 35 years, Dr. Evelyn Thorne, and their twin daughters, both now lawyers themselves. The photo sat next to a small wooden gavel, a gift from his first case as a juvenile court judge, engraved with the words, "Compassion guides judgment." Judge Thorne's approach to the bench reflected the man he had become rather than the lawyer he had trained to be. He kept his courtroom warm in winter and cool in summer, understanding that comfort could mean the difference between a child speaking truthfully or remaining silent out of fear. He had learned to read body language, to notice when a parent's answers didn't match their child's flinches, to recognize the subtle signs of trauma that often went unnoticed in the formal machinery of legal proceedings. This morning, reviewing Lena Hayes' case file, he had felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always preceded difficult decisions. The police report bore Officer Vance's signature, describing an encounter that seemed routine on paper, but felt wrong in ways that were hard to articulate. The language was too polished, too careful, filled with the kind of clinical descriptions that often masked more complex truths. Vance's name had appeared in his courtroom before, always in cases involving black children, always with the same language about challenging behavior and non-compliance. Judge Thorne had made discreet inquiries. with colleagues, discovering a pattern that troubled him deeply, but had never quite crossed the line into actionable concern. Vance was careful, professional in his reports, and backed by a department that had never seen fit to question his methods. But patterns told stories that individual cases could not, and Elias Thorne had not spent 2 decades protecting children. To ignore the story that was slowly emerging from the files that crossed his desk. He had learned to trust his instincts, especially when those instincts put him at odds with the system he served. Looking at Lena Hayes now, seeing the way he held himself with careful dignity despite his obvious fear, he was reminded of his own son at that age, walking into new schools with his head held high even when he was the only black face in his class. The comparison wasn't lost on him, nor was the responsibility it implied. Some fights chose you, regardless of whether you felt ready for them. The question wasn't whether Officer Vance had overstepped his authority. Judge Thorne was increasingly certain that he had. The question was whether the system would support a black judge, challenging a white officer's credibility, or whether he would find himself standing alone when the consequences came. The tension in Courtroom 3C grew thick enough to taste as officer. Vance settled into the witness chair with the casual confidence of a man who had never been seriously challenged in this setting. His uniform seemed to fill the space around him, the metal of his badge catching the overhead lights, a signal of untouchable authority. Judge Thorne observed the performance with the practiced eye of someone who had seen power assert itself in countless forms, but rarely so openly. "Officer Vance," Judge Thorne began, his voice maintaining its characteristic calm, "I'd like you to walk through the events of last Wednesday afternoon. Please be specific about the sequence of actions and your observations." Vance leaned back slightly, a gesture that would have been subtle if not for the context. In a courtroom where respect for judicial authority was foundational, even small displays of casual disregard carried weight. I was conducting routine patrol in the Riverbend district when I observed a group of juveniles congregating near the bus stop at Elm and Oak. Based on recent reports of petty theft in the area, I decided to conduct a community contact. And by community contact, you mean? I approached the group to assess the situation and ensure they weren't engaged in suspicious activity. Vance's tone carried the practiced patience of someone explaining obvious concepts to a slower student. It's standard community policing, engaging with residents to maintain public safety. Judge Thorne made a note, his pen moving deliberately across the legal pad. How many juveniles were in this group? 5, 3 males and 2 females. And their approximate ages? Vance shrugged, the motion causing his duty belt to creak. Teenagers. 13 to 16, maybe 17 for the older boys. Yet only Mr. Hayes was cited. Can you explain why? For the first time, Vance's confidence flickered. He glanced toward the prosecution table, then back to Judge Thorne, as if expecting support that wasn't forthcoming. The others complied with my instructions immediately. The subject, Mr. Hayes, displayed behavior that required additional attention. What specific behavior? He maintained direct eye contact when I told the group to disperse. When I addressed him directly, he didn't lower his gaze or acknowledge my authority. His posture remained confrontational throughout the interaction. In the gallery, Clara Hayes felt her son's hand find hers, small fingers intertwining with desperate need for comfort. Lena had told her mother what really happened that afternoon, how he had been waiting for the bus with friends, how Officer Vance had approached them aggressively, how he had been too scared to look away when he started yelling at them. But fear, apparently, looked like defiance to a man trained to see threats in the simple dignity of a black child refusing to be invisible. Judge Thorne set down his pen and looked directly at Vance. "Officer, are you familiar with the Fourth Amendment protections regarding unreasonable search and seizure?" "Of course." Vance's answer came too quickly, carrying an edge of irritation that hadn't been there before. Then you understand that citizens, including minors, have the right to remain in public spaces without being compelled to explain their presence, unless there's reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. Vance's jaw tightened visibly. Your Honor, with respect, I understand my job. These kids were loitering in an area with recent criminal activity. I had every right to investigate, and Mr. Hayes' eye contact. Criminal behavior, how exactly? The question hung in the air like a challenge thrown down between two very different definitions of justice. Vance's pale eyes narrowed slightly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note that made several people in the courtroom sit up straighter. Look, Your Honor, I've been doing this job for 18 years. I know the difference between respect and defiance. That boy was looking at me like he had something to prove, and in my experience, that attitude leads to bigger problems. If you don't address it immediately. Bigger problems? Judge Thorne repeated slowly. Such as resistance, escalation, the kind of situation where someone gets hurt. Vance leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a more intimate register. I'm trying to prevent these kids from making mistakes that could ruin their lives. Sometimes that means teaching respect before it's too late. The words landed in the courtroom like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples of discomfort that spread through the gallery. Judge Thorne felt something shift inside him. Not anger, not yet, but a cold clarity that came when someone revealed more truth than they intended. The silence that followed Vance's statement felt different from the usual quiet of legal proceedings. This was the silence of people processing something that couldn't be unheard, words that had revealed too much about their speaker's true nature. Judge Thorne removed his glasses and cleaned them with deliberate care, a gesture that gave him time to consider his next words while letting the weight of Vance's admission settle over the courtroom. Officer Vance, he said finally, replacing his glasses with precise movements. Did you just suggest that your role includes teaching respect to citizens who have committed no crime? Vance's confident posture faltered slightly. Perhaps he sensed that he had ventured into dangerous territory, or perhaps he simply didn't like being questioned by someone he clearly viewed as an inferior. I said I was trying to prevent situations from escalating. That's good police work. By intimidating a 15-year-old boy for making eye contact, he wasn't intimidated. He was defiant. Vance's voice rose slightly, the professional veneer beginning to crack. Certain individuals need to understand that there are consequences for disrespectful behavior. The phrase certain individuals hung in the air like a neon sign, illuminating everything that had been implicit in the conversation up to this point. Judge Thorne felt the familiar burning in his chest that came when prejudice revealed itself so plainly that denial became impossible. Around the courtroom, he could see the recognition dawning on Faces Court staff, attorneys, observers who had just witnessed a police officer categorize an entire group of people as inherently disrespectful. Certain individuals, Officer Vance? Judge Thorne's voice remained steady, but something in his tone made Vance stiffen. To whom, exactly, are you referring? Vance realized his mistake too late. His face flushed red, and he glanced around the courtroom as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. I meant juvenile offenders. Kids who don't understand proper behavior when dealing with law enforcement. Mr. Hayes isn't a juvenile offender. He's an honor roll student with no prior arrests, no disciplinary problems at school, and no history of any kind of antisocial behavior. So when you use that phrase, what criteria are you using to categorize him? The question was surgical in its precision, cutting through every possible deflection to expose the raw nerve of Vance's prejudice. The officer's hands, which had been resting casually on the witness chair's armrests, clenched into fists. His Breathing became more pronounced, the kind of physical tension that preceded either retreat or attack. "Your Honor, I don't appreciate the implication of your question." Vance's voice carried a warning that would have been shocking in any courtroom, but felt especially violative in this formal space where judicial authority was meant to be absolute. "I've served this community faithfully for 18 years. I've put my life on the line to protect people, including people from your background and that boy's." The phrase, "people from your background," landed with a thud across every principle of judicial dignity and courtroom decorum. Judge Thorne felt the collective intake of breath from the gallery, the sharp shock of witnessing someone challenge not just a judge's ruling, but his very right to occupy the bench. Clara Hayes pulled her son closer, instinctively shielding him from the negativity that was spilling into what should have been a place of protection. Judge Thorne stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. At 6 feet tall, he wasn't as physically imposing as Vance, but his presence seemed to fill the courtroom in a way that had nothing to do with size. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every ancestor who had fought for the right of black men to sit in judgment of white men's actions. "Officer Vance, you will address this court with the respect it deserves, or you will be held in contempt. Your service record does not grant you the right to question the authority of this bench, or to categorize citizens based on their race." Vance rose from the witness chair, his own height making him tower over the judicial bench in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. "I know exactly what kind of respect this court deserves," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "And I know the difference between justice and politics." The line had been crossed. In 30 years of legal practice, Judge Thorne had never encountered such blatant disrespect for judicial authority, and everyone in the courtroom understood that. What happened next would define more than just this case. The tension crackling between Judge Thorne and Officer Vance had transformed the courtroom into something electric, dangerous, where every breath felt measured and every movement carried weight beyond its physical presence. Sarah Jenkins, the court's senior legal assistant, sat frozen at her desk near the judge's bench, her pen hovering over the transcript she could no longer pretend to focus on. In 17 years of recording court proceedings, she had never witnessed such open antagonism directed at a sitting judge. Sarah's mind raced as she processed what she was witnessing. Vance's file had crossed her desk dozens of times over the past 4 years, and she had begun to notice patterns that troubled her professional conscience. Always black children, always the same language about challenging behavior and non-compliance. Always cases that seemed to disappear into plea bargains or administrative resolutions that left no paper trail for appeal or review. She had mentioned her concerns to colleagues, but carefully, indirectly, in the way that junior staff learned to raise uncomfortable questions without seeming to challenge their superiors. The response had always been the same. Vance was a decorated officer with commendations for community service. His reports were thorough and professional. If there were problems, surely his supervisors would have noticed. But watching him now, seeing the barely controlled anger in his eyes as he stared down a black judge, Sarah realized that the problem wasn't invisible. It was simply protected by willful blindness and institutional inertia. She quietly opened her laptop and began pulling up files, cross-referencing dates and case numbers with a precision born of sudden, crystalline purpose. In the gallery, Clara Hayes felt her son's trembling intensify as Vance's hostility filled the space around them. Lena had been struggling with anxiety since the incident last Wednesday, waking up in the middle of the night from dreams where large men in uniforms chased him through endless corridors. But seeing her mother's face now, tight with controlled anger and protective fierceness, gave him a different kind of education about courage under pressure. "Mama," Lena whispered, his voice barely audible, "why is he so angry?" Clara Hayes had been asking herself the same question for a week, ever since her son had come home from school shaking and confused about why waiting for a bus could suddenly become a crime. Now, watching Vance challenge a judge's authority with the casual confidence of someone who had never faced consequences, she understood that the answer was both simpler and more complex than she had imagined. Because he's not used to being questioned by people like us. Baby, she whispered back, her arm tightening around her son's shoulders. But that's going to change today. Near the back of the courtroom, Alex Reed pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. As an investigative reporter for the City Chronicle, he had attended dozens of routine court hearings, usually searching for human interest stories or following up on cases with broader social implications. But what he was witnessing felt like something more significant, a moment when the careful facades that allowed institutional prejudice to function smoothly were being stripped away in real time. Alex had covered enough police misconduct stories to recognize the signs, the defensive aggression, the casual dehumanization, the assumption of immunity from consequences, but he had rarely seen it displayed so openly, with such confident contempt for oversight. His fingers moved across his phone's keyboard, sending messages to his editor and photographer, requesting immediate backup to document what might become a significant story. Other observers in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, some recognizing the historical weight of what they were witnessing. Ms. Eleanor Green, a retired teacher who had attended court to support a neighbor's custody case, found herself thinking of her own grandsons, both teenagers, both tall and athletic, both subject to the same kind of scrutiny that had landed Lena Hayes in this courtroom. She had lived through integration, had fought for the right of black children to attend decent schools, but had never imagined she would witness a police officer challenge a black judge's authority so brazenly. The courtroom had become a pressure cooker, filled with people who understood that they were watching something historic unfold, not because of its drama, but because of its naked honesty about power, race, and the fragility of progress that many had assumed was permanent. Judge Thorne surveyed the faces around him, seeing recognition, concern, and anticipation. Whatever happened next would ripple far beyond a single case, and everyone present seemed to understand that they were about to become witnesses to something that would demand they choose sides. The lunch recess provided no relief from the tension that had built like storm. Pressure in courtroom 3C. Judge Thorne retreated to his chambers, closing the door with deliberate care before allowing himself a moment to process what had just occurred. In 3 decades of legal practice, he had faced hostility, prejudice, and professional challenges, but never such brazen disrespect for the judicial process itself. Vance's behavior suggested a man who believed himself immune from consequences, a dangerous assumption that usually came from experience rather than arrogance. Sarah Jenkins knocked softly on the chamber door, her arms full of files and her laptop balanced precariously on top. "Your Honor, I need to show you something." She spread the documents across his desk with the methodical precision of someone who had spent hours organizing evidence into an undeniable pattern. Case files, incident reports, and court transcripts formed a timeline that stretched back 4 years, each bearing Officer Vance's signature and disturbingly similar language. "I've been tracking these for months," Sarah said, her voice tight with controlled urgency. "Always black children between 12 and 16. Always the same charges: disorderly conduct, challenging behavior, failure to comply. But look at this." She pointed to a series of dates highlighted in yellow. Every case that went to trial was either plea bargained down or dismissed on procedural grounds. The families never got their day in court. Judge Thorne studied the documents with growing unease. The pattern was unmistakable. Vance targeted black children with the confidence of someone who knew the system would support his version of events. But there was something else, a gap in the timeline that suggested missing pieces. "What about this period?" he asked, pointing to a 7-month span with no Vance-related cases. "March through September, 4 years ago." Sarah's expression darkened. "That's when the Jamal Dixon case happened. Vance was on administrative leave during the investigation, but he was cleared and returned to duty with a commendation for exemplary service." The name Jamal Dixon triggered a memory that Judge Thorne had tried to suppress. He remembered the news coverage, a 16-year-old boy found deceased during what police described as a high-speed chase. The case had been handled in criminal court, not juvenile court, but the story had haunted him because Jamal Dixon had been the same age as his own son, another black child whose life had been reduced to a paragraph in the newspaper. "Do you have access to the Dixon file?" Sarah hesitated. "Not officially. It was sealed after the administrative review, but..." She pulled out a manila envelope from the bottom of her stack. "I have a contact in records who thought someone should see the original incident report before it was amended." The document Sarah handed him was a photocopy, but clear enough to read the handwritten notes in the margins, notes that had been omitted from the final, official report. Judge Thorne read with mounting horror. Subject appeared to be fleeing when pursuit began. No weapon recovered at scene. Officer Vance's initial statement inconsistent with physical evidence. But it was the final note, written in different handwriting, that made his blood run cold. Recommend administrative resolution. Media attention minimal. Family unlikely to pursue civil action. "Sarah," Judge Thorne said slowly, "who else has seen this? My contact destroyed the original after making this copy. She was scared, said too many people were asking questions about Dixon's death, and then suddenly, they all stopped asking." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "Your Honor, I think Jamal Dixon was unlawfully killed. And I think Vance has been getting away with targeting black children ever since, because he knows nobody will challenge him. What would you do if your child was next?" Judge Thorne stared at the documents spread across his desk, each one representing a family's trust in a system that had failed them systematically. The case before him was no longer about Lena Hayes' right to hold a phone in public. It was about a pattern of abuse that had been enabled by institutional indifference and protected by administrative silence. The afternoon session would resume in 20 minutes, and Officer Vance would return to the witness stand, expecting the same deference he had always received. But Judge Thorne now understood this case was bigger than one man's prejudices or one child's dignity. This was about whether the system he had devoted his life to serving was capable of confronting its own failures, even when those failures wore badges and hid behind the language of public safety. The question was no longer whether he had the authority to challenge Vance. It was whether he had the courage to follow the evidence wherever it led, regardless of the consequences for his career or his safety. The afternoon session began with a different energy, as if the very air in Courtroom 3C had been charged with electricity during the lunch break. Judge Thorne entered with measured steps, carrying himself with the same dignified composure that had defined his career. But those who knew him well could detect something harder in his posture, a resolve that hadn't been there that morning. Sarah Jenkins had positioned herself at her desk with strategic precision, the copied documents within easy reach, but carefully concealed beneath routine paperwork. Officer Vance returned to the witness stand with the swagger of a man who believed he had established dominance during the morning session. His uniform remained crisp despite the day's tensions, his badge catching the overhead lights like a talisman of untouchable authority. He settled into the chair with casual ownership, as if the witness stand was simply another space where his will would naturally prevail. "Officer Vance," Judge Thorne began, his voice carrying a new edge that made several observers sit up straighter. "I'd like to revisit your earlier testimony about community policing practices. How long have you been assigned to patrol the Riverbend district? Vance's eyebrows rose slightly, perhaps surprised by the change in tone, but not yet concerned. 4.5 years, Your Honor, since I returned from administrative leave in October 2020. And during that time, how many juveniles would you estimate you've cited for behavioral violations? I don't keep exact counts, but probably 50 or 60 cases. Most of them resolved without trial. Kids learn their lesson and stay out of trouble. Vance's answer came easily, delivered with the confidence of someone who had never been required to justify his methods in detail. Judge Thorne made a note, his pen moving deliberately across the legal pad. Of those 50 or 60 cases, can you estimate what percentage involved minority juveniles? The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Vance's confident expression flickered, and he glanced toward the prosecution table before answering. I don't pay attention to race, Your Honor. I respond to behavior, not demographics. That's admirable, officer, but surely you can provide a rough estimate. Half? 3/4? Vance shifted in his chair, the leather of his duty belt creaking. Audibly in the courtroom silence, I patrol an area with diverse demographics. The citations reflect the population I serve. According to census data, the Riverbend district is 48% black. Would you say your citations reflect that demographic breakdown? The mathematical precision of the question left no room for deflection. Vance's jaw tightened visibly, and when he spoke, his voice carried an edge of irritation that hadn't been there before. Your Honor, I don't think racial percentages are relevant to this case. We're here about one specific incident involving one specific individual who displayed inappropriate behavior. Actually, Officer Vance, we're here because you swore an oath to tell the truth about your actions as a law enforcement officer. A pattern of behavior is absolutely relevant to credibility. Judge Thorne's voice remained calm, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. So, I'll ask again, what percentage of your juvenile citations involved minority children? Vance's hands clenched on the armrests of the witness chair. Around the courtroom, people leaned forward almost imperceptibly, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The officer's pale eyes locked onto Judge Thorne's dark ones, and for a moment, the room felt charged with the same dangerous energy that preceded lightning strikes. Most of them, Vance said finally, the words forced out through clenched teeth. But that's because minority kids in that neighborhood are more likely to engage in disrespectful behavior toward authority figures. It's an issue with their background, not a policing problem. The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Clara Hayes felt her son's hand tighten in hers, while Sarah Jenkins began typing rapidly on her laptop, documenting every word of Vance's damning testimony. In the gallery, Alex Reed activated his phone's recording app, understanding that he was witnessing something that would demand immediate coverage. Judge Thorne moved his glasses and cleaned them with deliberate care, a gesture that gave him time to process the magnitude of what Vance had just confessed. When he replaced them and looked up, his expression was that of a man who had just watched someone hang themselves with their own rope. An issue with their background, officer. Vance, could you elaborate on what you mean by that? Vance realized too late that he had ventured into indefensible territory, but his pride wouldn't allow him to retreat. These kids grow up thinking they don't have to show respect to authority. Their parents don't teach them proper behavior. So, society has to step in and provide the education they're not getting at home. The courtroom erupted in a low murmur of shocked voices, quickly silenced by Judge Thorne's raised hand. But the damage was done. Vance had revealed the prejudiced assumptions that drove his policing style with a clarity that made denial impossible. The weight of Vance's words settled over courtroom 3C like toxic smoke, making breathing feel labored and dangerous. Judge Thorne sat in perfect stillness for nearly 30 seconds, allowing the full impact of the officer's testimony to penetrate every corner of the room. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, broken only by the soft scratch of Sarah Jenkins's pen as she documented what might prove to be the most crucial moments of the entire proceeding. In the gallery, Clara Hayes felt something shift inside her chest. Not the sharp pain of fresh injury, but the slow, steady burn of anger that had been building for years without a proper outlet. She had spent her son's entire childhood teaching Lena to be respectful, polite, and careful around authority figures, understanding instinctively that survival often depended on making himself invisible to people like Officer Vance. But watching this man dismiss her parenting, her community, and her child's dignity with such casual contempt, she realized that respectability had never been protection. It had only been another form of submission. Alex Reed's fingers moved rapidly across his phone screen, sending preliminary reports to his editor, with subject lines that reflected the historic nature of what he was witnessing. Police officer admits bias on witness stand. Juvenile court hearing becomes civil rights moment. Judge challenges systemic police misconduct in real time. His years of covering social justice issues had taught him to recognize inflection points, and this felt like one of those rare moments when institutional masks slipped completely away. Near the back of the courtroom, Ms. Eleanor Green found herself thinking of her own encounters with police officers over the decades, the careful deference she had learned to display, the way she had taught her children and grandchildren to move through the world with hands visible and voices quiet. She had accepted these accommodations as the price of peace, but hearing Vance's testimony, she realized that no amount of respectability would ever be enough for someone who viewed her very existence as inherently suspicious. Judge Thorne finally spoke, his voice carrying a quietness that somehow felt more powerful than shouting. Officer Vance, in your opinion, what would constitute appropriate behavior from a black teenager during a police encounter? Vance's confidence was wavering now, but his pride continued to drive him forward into increasingly dangerous territory. The same as any other kid. Immediate compliance, respectful language, no attitude or challenging behavior. And if a child maintains eye contact while complying with your instructions, eye contact can be a form of challenge, depending on the context and duration. What about asking questions about why they're being stopped? Vance's irritation flared visibly. Questions are often just disguised arguments. A respectful person follows instructions first and asks questions later, if at all. Judge Thorne made another note, each question and answer building towards something that everyone in the courtroom could feel approaching but couldn't yet define. So, in your professional opinion, a black teenager should avoid eye contact, should not ask questions about their rights, and should demonstrate immediate submission to your authority, regardless of whether they've committed any crime? The question was crafted with surgical precision, forcing Vance to either admit to unconstitutional policing practices or contradict his previous testimony. Vance's face flushed red as he realized the trap that had been carefully constructed. Around him, word by word, answer by answer. I didn't say anything about race, he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. I said all teenagers should show respect to law enforcement. Yet 97% of your juvenile citations in the past 4 years have involved black children? Judge Thorne said quietly, consulting the notes Sarah had discreetly passed to him. That's a remarkable coincidence for someone who claims not to see color. Vance's hands gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly that his knuckles went white. Those are just statistics. They don't prove anything about my motives. Perhaps not. But combined with your testimony about issues with their background and the need to educate children whose parents allegedly haven't taught them proper behavior, they paint a rather clear picture of your approach to community policing. The courtroom felt like a coiled spring, tension building towards some inevitable release. Vance's breathing had become audible, short, sharp intakes that suggested a man fighting to maintain control. His eyes darted around the room, perhaps noticing for the first time the faces watching him, black faces, white faces, all wearing expressions of recognition and dawning understanding. "Your Honor," Vance said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "I've served this community faithfully for 18 years. I've put my life on the line to protect people, including people from your background. I don't appreciate having my service record questioned by someone who's never walked a beat or faced real danger." The phrase, "people from your background," hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Judge Thorne felt the collective intake of breath from the gallery, the sharp shock of witnessing someone cross a line that should have been inviolable. But he also felt something else, a cold, crystalline clarity that came when someone revealed their true nature so completely that pretense became impossible. "Officer Vance," Judge Thorne said, rising slowly from his chair, "your service record is not being questioned. Your judgment, your methods, and your apparent belief that a citizen's race determines their worthiness of constitutional protection, those are being questioned, and rightfully so." Vance stood as well, his height making him tower over the judicial bench in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. The physical mismatch was obvious. Vance's 6'4" frame, broad shoulders, and tactical gear versus Judge Thorne's slender build and black robes. But everyone in the courtroom understood that true power in this space came not from physical presence, but from moral authority. "I know exactly what this is about," Vance said, his voice carrying a menace that made several people in the gallery shift uncomfortably. "This is about politics, not justice. This is about protecting offenders instead of victims. This is about turning law enforcement into social work." The mask had finally fallen completely away. Sarah Jenkins typed frantically, capturing every word of what was essentially a confession of the prejudices that had driven Vance's career. Alex Reed moved closer to the front of the courtroom, understanding that he was witnessing something that would demand national attention. Judge Thorne remained standing, his posture straight and dignified, despite the obvious threat in Vance's words. "Officer Vance, this is about equal protection under the law. This is about whether a 15-year-old boy has the right to exist in a public space without being criminalized for the color of his skin." The two men faced each other across the fundamental divide that had always existed in American justice. The gap between the law as written and the law as practiced, between the promise of equality and the reality of selective enforcement. Something was about to break. The courtroom fell into the kind of silence that preceded earthquakes, not peaceful, but charged with potential energy that needed only the smallest trigger to be released. Judge Thorne and Officer Vance stood facing each other across an ideological chasm that had been building throughout the afternoon, each representing not just their individual positions, but entire worldviews about power, race, and justice in America. Sarah Jenkins had been waiting for this moment. Her laptop was open to a folder she had labeled Dixon Investigation months ago. Her hands trembled slightly as she double-clicked on a video file that should have remained buried forever in police department servers. The footage began loading with agonizing slowness, each pixel representing the difference between official narrative and documented truth. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "I have evidence relevant to Officer Vance's pattern of behavior with minority youth." Vance's head snapped toward her, his eyes widening with something that might have been recognition or might have been fear. "This is about the Hayes case," he said quickly. "Whatever games you're playing with old files has nothing to do with current charges." Judge Thorne looked from Vance to Sarah, understanding that something crucial was about to be revealed. "What evidence, Miss Jenkins?" Sarah stood, her small frame somehow commanding the attention of everyone in the courtroom. Body camera footage from the Jamal Dixon incident 4 years ago. The original footage, before it was ruled inadmissible due to technical issues. The name Jamal Dixon dropped into the courtroom like a stone into still water, sending ripples of recognition through those old enough to remember the case. Vance's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, and finally, cold calculation. That footage was classified, Vance said, his voice low and dangerous. If you have access to sealed evidence, you've committed a felony. The footage was leaked to me by someone who couldn't live with the cover-up, Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. Someone who understood that some truths are too important to keep buried. Judge Thorne felt the weight of history settling over his courtroom. Whatever was on that video would either vindicate Vance's version of events or destroy him completely. There was no middle ground, no room for interpretation or administrative resolution. "Play the footage," he said quietly. The courtroom's attention shifted to the large monitor mounted on the wall, its blank screen reflecting the faces of people who understood they were about to witness something that would change everything. Vance remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides, watching the screen with the expression of a man staring at his own downfall. The video began with the jerky, low-resolution quality of body camera footage. The timestamp showed a date, 4 years ago, and the location was a residential street in the same Riverbend district where Vance now patrolled. The audio crackled to life with Vance's voice younger sounding but unmistakably his. Subject appears to be fleeing from the scene, Vance's recorded voice said, in pursuit on foot. The camera bounced as Vance ran, showing glimpses of a slight figure in dark clothing moving between parked cars. The figure stumbled, fell, and Vance's camera captured a clear view of Jamal Dixon's face. Young, terrified, obviously unarmed, hands raised in surrender. "Please don't hurt me." Jamal's voice came through the speakers, high and desperate. "I didn't do anything. I was just walking home." Vance's recorded voice was cold, professional. Subject is resisting arrest, preparing to deploy force. But they? Video showed something different. Jamal Dixon wasn't resisting. He was cowering, hands visible, backing away with the slow, careful movements of someone trying desperately not to be perceived as a threat. The disconnect between Vance's narration and the visual evidence was stark, undeniable. Subject reaching for potential weapon, Vance's voice continued, but the camera clearly showed Jamal's empty hands, raised above his head. The courtroom watched in horrified silence as the truth of Jamal Dixon's death played out on screen, not the heroic law enforcement action described in official reports, but the unlawful killing of a terrified child who had committed no crime, beyond existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. How many families are still waiting for justice? Vance's face had gone pale, his earlier arrogance replaced by the desperate look of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. The video continued to play, each frame stripping away. Years of carefully constructed lies and administrative cover-ups. Jamal Dixon's final moments unfolded with terrible clarity. A 16-year-old boy pleading for his life, hands raised in surrender, while Officer Vance's recorded voice created a false narrative of resistance and threat that would later justify his actions to investigators who were all too willing to accept his version of events. "I don't have a weapon." Jamal's voice cracked through the courtroom speakers, young and desperate. "Please, I don't have anything. I was just going to the park." The park pass found in Jamal's pocket after his death had shown exactly that, a valid pass issued 10 minutes before the incident. But that detail had been buried in the administrative review, deemed irrelevant to the determination of whether Vance had acted within policy. Vance's recorded voice continued its false narration, subject making aggressive movements toward waistband area, Threat assessment indicates immediate danger to officer safety. But the camera showed Jamal backing against a brick wall, tears streaming down his face, hands never leaving their raised position. The boy was trapped, terrified, and completely defenseless when Vance fired 3 shots into his chest from a distance of less than 10 feet. The audio captured Jamal's final words, "Tell my mom I love her." The silence that followed in the courtroom was profound, broken only by the soft sound of Clara Hayes crying and the sharp intake of breath from Miss Eleanor Green in the back row. Judge Thorne felt something fundamental shift inside him. Not just anger at Vance's actions, but fury at the system that had allowed this unlawful killing to be classified as justified force. Vance remained standing at the witness stand, his face cycling through expressions of defiance, fear, and calculation. When he spoke, his voice carried none of its earlier authority. "That video doesn't show the full context," he said desperately. "There were other factors, intelligence reports, about gang activity in the area. You can't judge a split-second decision based on incomplete footage." Sarah Jenkins had prepared for this moment, pulling up additional files on her laptop with the methodical precision of someone who would spend months building an unassailable case. "The complete police report," she said, projecting the document onto the courtroom monitor. No mention of weapons intelligence, no radio calls about suspicious activity, no indication that Jamal Dixon was anything other than a child walking home from the park. The report appeared on screen, bearing Vance's signature and the signatures of 3 supervising officers who had signed off on his version of events without question. The official narrative bore no resemblance to what the video had shown. It described an armed suspect, aggressive behavior, and justified the use of deadly force in the face of imminent danger. Alex Reed had stopped taking notes, understanding that his story had evolved from a courtroom confrontation into something much larger. The exposure of systematic police misconduct and the institutional mechanisms that protected officers who used unlawful force from consequences. His phone was recording continuously now, capturing both the video evidence and the reactions of people witnessing the truth for the first time. "Your Honor," Vance said, his voice taking on a pleading quality that contrasted sharply with his earlier arrogance, "I followed department protocol. I was cleared by Internal Affairs and the District Attorney's Office. This case was closed years ago." Judge Thorne looked at the man before him, no longer the confident officer who had entered his courtroom that morning, but a desperate individual, watching his carefully constructed world collapse under the weight of documented truth. "Officer Vance," Judge Thorne said, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority backed by moral clarity. "This case may have been closed by administrative convenience, but it was never closed by justice. The unlawful killing of Jamal Dixon was covered up by a system more interested in protecting its reputation than protecting the children it swore to serve." Vance's eyes darted around the courtroom, perhaps searching for support that was no longer there. Even the prosecutor assigned to the Hayes case had gone silent, understanding that continuing to defend Vance would mean defending the indefensible. "I want to know," Judge Thorne continued, "how many other Jamal Dixons there have been. How many other families have been told their children's deaths were justified while video evidence of an unlawful killing gathered dust in police servers?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to every institution that had enabled Vance's career, every official who had signed off on his reports, every system that had prioritized order over truth. The revelation of Jamal Dixon's unlawful killing had transformed the courtroom into something beyond a legal proceeding. It had become a reckoning with the fundamental nature of justice in America. Judge Thorne sat back down, his hands folded carefully on the bench, while Vance remained standing at the witness stand like a man caught in a spotlight with nowhere to hide. "Officer Vance," Judge Thorne said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone delivering judgment. You've just watched video evidence of yourself unlawfully killing an unarmed child. You've heard his final words. You've seen him beg for his life. And your response is to claim that this was justified police work. Vance's jaw worked silently for several seconds before he found his voice. It was a split-second decision in a dangerous situation. Every officer knows that hesitation can mean death. I followed my training. Your training taught you to use deadly force on surrendering children? My training taught me to neutralize threats before they neutralize me. Vance's voice was rising, desperation bleeding through his attempts at professional composure. You sit up there in your robe making judgments about situations you've never faced. You don't know what it's like to make life or death decisions in the field. Judge Thorne leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Vance's face. You're right, officer. I've never taken a child's life and then lied about it for 4 years. I've never covered up evidence of my own crimes. I've never hidden behind a badge while destroying families with my prejudice and aggression. The words hit Vance like physical blows. His face flushed red, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. You think you're better than me? You think wearing that robe makes you some kind of moral authority? I think taking an oath to protect and serve means something more than targeting children with extreme prejudice. Judge Thorne replied, his voice remaining calm despite the explosive tension building in the room. Vance took a step closer to the bench, his movement causing several people in the gallery to shift nervously. You don't know anything about the real world. You don't know what some people are capable of when you're not watching. Some people again, Officer Vance. Judge Thorne stood up, matching Vance's aggressive posture with quiet dignity. You mean children like Jamal Dixon? Like Lena Hayes? Like the dozens of other black youth you've intimidated with the confidence that the system would never hold. You accountable? Vance's mask of professional authority had completely crumbled, revealing the raw animus underneath. You want to know the truth? Fine. These kids grow up thinking they own the streets. They think they can disrespect authority and get away with it. They think their attitude problems should be tolerated because of their background. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs, but Vance continued, his voice growing louder and more erratic with each word. I've seen what happens when you let them get away with defiance. They escalate. They become troublemakers. They join gangs. They destroy communities. Sometimes, stopping one prevents 10 others from following the same path. Sarah Jenkins typed, frantically documenting every word of Vance's self-incriminating rant. Alex Reed activated his phone's video function, understanding that Vance was providing a masterclass in how institutional prejudice justified itself through dehumanization and fear. So Jamal Dixon had to die to send the message? Judge Thorne's voice cut through Vance's tirade like a scalpel. A 16-year-old boy going to the park was subjected to deadly force because you decided he represented some future threat? Vance realized he had said too much, revealed too much, but his pride wouldn't let him retreat. I protected this community from someone who would have grown up to be a problem. That boy was already showing signs of defiance. His attitude toward authority was clear from his body language, his refusal to immediately comply. His body language, Judge Thorne repeated slowly. You ended a child's life because you didn't like his body language. The stark simplicity of the statement stripped away every layer of justification, every professional euphemism, every attempt to dress up an unlawful killing as law enforcement. Vance stood exposed as what he had always been, not a protector, but an aggressor who had used his badge to intimidate children with impunity. You people always twist things, he said contemptuously, his voice dripping with disdain. You always make it about race when it's about respect. It's about law and order. The phrase "you people" sealed his fate. removing any possibility of walking back his confessions or claiming his words had been misunderstood. Judge Thorne had heard enough. The man standing before him had confessed to a killing, admitted to systematic racial profiling, and revealed a worldview so poisoned by hostility that redemption seemed impossible. But there was one more piece of evidence that needed to be revealed, one final nail in the coffin of Vance's career and credibility. "Miss Jenkins," Judge Thorne said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had reached the end of his patience, "please play the audio file." Sarah's fingers moved across her laptop keyboard with practiced precision, calling up a sound file that she had been saving for this moment. The courtroom speakers crackled to life with voices that were clearly recognizable as Vance and another man, recorded in what sounded like a bar or restaurant setting. "The problem with policing today," Vance's recorded voice said, slightly slurred but unmistakably his, "is that we're not allowed to do our jobs properly anymore. Every time we take down one of these offenders, some bleeding heart judge or activist starts crying about excessive force." The second voice, identified by Sarah as Lieutenant Miller, Vance's immediate supervisor, responded with a laugh. "Tell me about it. Remember that Dixon kid? The kid got exactly what he deserved, but we had to dance around the family's feelings for months. That boy was asking for it," Vance's voice continued, clear and unrepentant, "walking around like he owned the neighborhood, giving me attitude when I tried to question him. These kids need to learn that actions have consequences. Too bad there aren't more cops willing to teach that lesson." Miller replied, "Maybe we'd have fewer problems in these communities if more of them understood what happens when you disrespect authority." Vance laughed, the sound chilling in its casual cruelty. "Don't worry about that. I make sure every kid in my district knows the score. Most of them learn real quick after they see what happened to their friend Jamal." The audio continued for several more minutes, documenting a conversation between two police officers speaking callously about the death of a child and using it as a tool of intimidation against other black youth in their district. The recording captured not just Vance's guilt, but the institutional support that had enabled his crimes. In the courtroom, Vance's face had gone ashen. He stared at the speakers as if they were broadcasting his own death sentence, which, in many ways, they were. His earlier bluster and aggression had evaporated, replaced by the hollow look of a man who realized that his secret thoughts had been preserved for posterity. "Where did you get that?" Vance whispered, his voice barely audible. "Someone who couldn't live with the silence anymore," Sarah replied. "Someone who understood that covering up an unlawful killing makes you complicit." In it, Judge Thorne felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. The man before him had spent 4 years believing he was untouchable, protected by institutional loyalty and administrative indifference. But truth had a way of surfacing, especially when good people decided that their consciences mattered more than their careers. "Officer Vance," Judge Thorne said, his voice carrying the finality of judgment, "you have just been exposed as a man who used his position to intimidate black children with the full knowledge and support of your superiors. You have confessed to systematic racial profiling, to using Jamal Dixon's death as a tool of intimidation, and to viewing the death of children as an acceptable method of community control." Vance opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What defense could he offer against his own recorded voice? What justification could survive the clarity of documented confession? Furthermore, Judge Thorne continued, "You have revealed a culture of police misconduct that extends far beyond your individual actions. Lieutenant Miller, your supervisor, is heard on this recording speaking callously about the death of a child and encouraging more aggression against black youth. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about one rogue officer. It was about an entire system that had been corrupted from the ground up. where children's deaths were seen as acceptable policy as long as the victims were black. Alex Reed was already composing headlines in his mind. Police officer confesses to unlawful killing on audio recording. Supervisor condoned death of black teenager. Federal investigation imminent after courtroom revelations. The story had exploded far beyond a simple, disorderly conduct case into a national scandal that would demand immediate federal intervention. The weight of Vance's exposed crimes hung over Courtroom 3C like a toxic cloud, making every breath feel labored and dangerous. Judge Thorne sat in perfect stillness, allowing the full implications of the audio recording to settle into the consciousness of everyone present. Vance stood at the witness stand like a man watching his entire world collapse in real time, his earlier swagger replaced by the desperate look of someone with no way out. The silence stretched for nearly a minute, broken only by the soft sound of Clara Hayes crying and the rapid clicking of Sarah Jenkins's keyboard as she documented every detail of Vance's psychological collapse. Alex Reed moved closer to the front of the courtroom, understanding that he was witnessing something that would dominate headlines for months to come. Finally, Vance found his voice, though it came out as a harsh whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "You set me up. This whole thing was a setup from the beginning." Judge Thorne removed his glasses and cleaned them with deliberate care, a gesture that gave him time to consider his words while the tension in the room built towards some inevitable explosion. "Officer Vance, the only person who set you up was yourself. Every word on that recording came from your mouth. Every confession was your choice." Vance's hands were trembling now, his face cycling between rage and panic as he realized that there was no way to undo the damage he had inflicted on himself. "You don't understand the pressure we're under. You don't know what it's like to patrol these neighborhoods, to deal with those people every single day." "Those people?" Judge Thorne repeated, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of injustice. "How you keep using that phrase, Officer Vance. What exactly do you mean by those people?" Vance's composure finally shattered completely. The careful mask of professional authority that he had maintained throughout his career fell away, revealing the raw hostility that had always driven his actions. His voice rose to a shout that echoed off the marble walls of the courtroom. "You know exactly what I mean. The troublemakers, the offenders, the people who think they can disrespect authority and get away with it." Vance's face was flushed red, spittle flying from his lips as years of suppressed rage poured out. "You sit up there in your fancy robe, pretending to care about justice, but you're just protecting your own people." The phrase "your own people" hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Judge Thorne felt the collective gasp from the gallery, the sharp intake of breath that came when someone crossed a line that should never be crossed. But he also felt something else rising inside him, not anger, but a cold, crystalline clarity. That came when someone revealed their true nature so completely that pretense became impossible. Judge Thorne stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. At his full height, he still wasn't as physically imposing as Vance, but his presence seemed to fill the courtroom in a way that had nothing to do with size. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of every principle that Vance had just violated. "Officer Vance, you will address this court with respect, or you will be held in contempt. Your years of service do not give you the right to use such language in my courtroom." Vance took a step toward the bench, his height and bulk making him tower over the judicial platform in a way that felt deliberately threatening. "Who do you think you are?" he screamed, his voice cracking with fury and desperation. "Just because you wear a judge's robe, you think you can order me around?" Before anyone could react, before security could intervene, before the weight of institutional authority could assert itself, Vance's hand swung in a wide arc that connected with Judge Thorne's face with a loud sound. The slap echoed through the marble halls of justice with a finality that seemed to stop time itself. Judge Thorne's head snapped to the side, but his body didn't move. He absorbed the blow with the same dignity he had shown throughout the hearing, his eyes never closing, his posture never wavering. The courtroom fell into a silence so complete that the only sound was Vance's heavy breathing and the distant hum of fluorescent lights. Every person present understood that they had just witnessed something historic, not just an assault on a judge, but the moment when the mask of institutional authority was stripped away to reveal the ugliness. Beneath Judge Thorne slowly turned, his face back toward Vance, the red handprint stark against his dark skin. His eyes held a calm that was more devastating than any rage could have been. The aftermath of Vance's attack unfolded with surreal clarity, as if time had slowed to allow everyone present to fully absorb the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Judge Thorne remained standing, the red mark of Vance's hand vivid against his cheek, but his expression held no trace of pain or anger, only the quiet dignity of someone who had absorbed an assault against justice itself and refused to be broken by it. Vance stood frozen, his hand still raised from the blow, his face cycling through expressions of shock, defiance, and dawning horror as he realized what he had done. The courtroom security officers, momentarily stunned by the unprecedented nature of the attack, suddenly moved into action with practiced efficiency. "Step away from the bench." The lead security officer's voice cut through the silence like a whip crack. Two officers approached Vance from either side, their movements careful but determined, understanding that they were dealing with an armed individual who had just crossed every line of acceptable behavior. But Judge Thorne raised his own hand, stopping the officers in their tracks. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and clear, carrying the authority of someone who had just been physically assaulted but refused to be diminished by it. "I want this act formally recorded," he said, his eyes never leaving Vance's face. "Let the record show that Officer Derek Vance, while under oath as a witness in this court, has physically assaulted a sitting judge in open session before multiple witnesses." Sarah Jenkins's fingers flew across her keyboard, documenting every detail of the attack and its aftermath. Alex Reed held his phone steady, recording both the red mark on Judge Thorne's face and Vance's expression of mounting panic as he realized that his career, his freedom, and his future had just been destroyed by a moment of uncontrolled rage. Furthermore, Judge Thorne continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "Let the record show that this assault occurred immediately after Officer Vance was confronted with audio evidence of his confessing to the unlawful killing of Jamal Dixon and his systematic targeting of black children in his patrol area." Vance's legs seemed to give way slightly, and he sank back into the witness chair as if the weight of his actions had suddenly become unbearable. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't thinking clearly." "You were thinking very clearly, Officer Vance," Judge Thorne replied, dabbing at his cheek with a tissue that Sarah had discreetly provided. "You were thinking that a black judge had no right to hold you accountable for your actions. You were thinking that your badge gave you immunity from consequences. You were thinking that aggression was an appropriate response to being confronted with your crimes." The courtroom doors opened to admit 3 Federal Bureau of Investigation agents, their timing so precise that it seemed choreographed. The lead agent, a stern-faced woman in a dark suit, approached the bench with credentials already in hand. "Your Honor, I'm Agent Olivia Sterling with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Civil Rights Division. We've been monitoring this proceeding based on evidence that was brought to our attention earlier today." She gestured toward Vance, who was now slumped in the witness chair like a deflated balloon. "We have warrants for Officer Vance's arrest on federal charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy to commit an unlawful killing, and obstruction of justice." Vance looked up with wild eyes, perhaps only now understanding that his assault on Judge Thorne had been witnessed not just by local court personnel, but by federal law enforcement officials who had been building a case against him. "This is all a setup," he said desperately. "They planned this whole thing to entrap me." Agent Sterling approached Vance with handcuffs, her expression professionally neutral. "Officer Derek Vance, you are under arrest for violations of federal civil rights law. You have the right to remain silent." As the Miranda warning was read, Judge Thorne finally allowed himself to sit down, the adrenaline of the confrontation giving way to the steady pulse of justice asserting itself. He looked out over the courtroom, seeing faces that reflected shock, satisfaction, and something deeper, the recognition that they had witnessed a system finally working as it was supposed to. "This court," Judge Thorne said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "stands for the principle that no one is above the law. Not officers, not judges, not officials of any rank or station. Justice delayed is not justice denied when good people decide to speak truth to power." Vance was led away in handcuffs, his footsteps echoing through the marble halls where he had once strutted with unquestioned authority. The arrestive officer, Derek Vance, sent shockwaves through every level of law enforcement in the county, but the tremors reached far beyond the local police department. Within hours of the courtroom attack, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had executed search warrants at 3 precincts, seizing computers, files, and surveillance equipment as part of what Agent Sterling described as the most comprehensive civil rights investigation in the region's history. Lieutenant Miller, Vance's immediate supervisor, whose voice had been captured speaking callously about Jamal Dixon's death, was arrested at her home that evening while eating dinner with her family. The image of her being led away in handcuffs, still wearing her civilian clothes, became the lead story on every local news channel and social media platform. 52 additional officers were placed on administrative leave pending investigation, their cases to be reviewed by a joint federal-state task force with subpoena power and unlimited resources. "Are you ready to stand up when it matters?" Judge Thorne returned to his chambers after the longest day of his judicial career, his face still bearing the faint outline of Vance's handprint. The physical mark would fade within days, but he understood that the symbolic impact would resonate for much longer. His desk was already covered with requests for interviews, speaking engagements, and legal commentaries, but he pushed them aside to focus on a single manila folder, Lena Hayes' case file. The charges against Lena were dismissed with prejudice within an hour of Vance's arrest, but Judge Thorne knew that the real work was just beginning. How many other children had been intimidated by Vance's systematic prejudice? How many families had been destroyed by a system that prioritized officer protection over victim justice? How many other Jamal Dixons had died while good people remained silent? Sarah Jenkins knocked softly on his chamber door, carrying a stack of files that represented 4 years of meticulous documentation. "Your Honor, I've identified 58 additional cases involving Officer Vance that need immediate review. Some involve children as young as 10 years old." Judge Thorne felt the weight of those numbers settle in his chest like stones. 58 children whose only crime had been existing while black in Vance's patrol area. 58 families who had been told their children deserved whatever treatment they received. 58 cases that had been processed through a system designed to protect officers rather than citizens. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "I need you to authorize a special review board with the power to reopen every case Vance touched in the past 6 years. I need subpoena authority to access sealed records, and I need protection for the witnesses who are going to come forward once they realize it's finally safe to tell the truth." The scope of the investigation was staggering, but Judge Thorne understood that half measures would only allow the corruption to metastasize in new forms. "Done. Draft the orders tonight. We'll convene the review board tomorrow morning. Meanwhile, at the Hayes family's small apartment, Clara Hayes held her son close while they watched news coverage of Vance's arrest on their television. Lena had been quiet since returning from court, processing the reality that the man who had terrified him was now facing federal charges for crimes that stretched back years. "Mama," Lena said softly, "was I hurt like he hurt that other boy?" Clara Hayes felt her heart break for every parent who had faced that question, every family that had lost a child to the kind of hostility Vance represented. "I don't know, baby, but you're safe now. And because you were brave enough to tell the truth, other kids are going to be safe too." 3 states away, Ms. Elena Dixon received a phone call from Agent Sterling, informing her that her son Jamal's case was being reopened as a federal murder investigation. For 4 years, she had been told that her son's death was justified, that he had brought it on himself through some imagined defiance. Now, finally, someone in authority was acknowledging what she had known all along, that her boy had been unlawfully killed in cold blood by a man who saw his life as worthless. The institutional changes came swiftly. The police department's entire training curriculum was suspended pending federal review. Body camera policies were revised to prevent the kind of technical difficulties that had allowed Vance's crimes to be covered up. Community oversight boards were established with real investigative power and independent budgets. But perhaps the most significant change was intangible, the recognition that silence in the face of injustice was no longer acceptable. That good. People had a moral obligation to speak truth to power, regardless of the personal cost. 7 months after the push that echoed through the halls of justice, Judge Elias Thorne received an unexpected visitor in his chambers. The woman who knocked on his door was impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit, her credentials identifying her as Associate Justice Evelyn Sterling from the Federal Court of Appeals. She carried with her an offer that would have transformed most: legal careers, nomination to the High Court of the Commonwealth. "Judge Thorne," Justice Sterling said, settling into the chair across from his desk, "your handling of the Vance case has drawn national attention. The President believes your voice would bring essential perspective to the highest court in the land." Judge Thorne listened respectfully as she outlined the nomination process, the confirmation hearings, and the lifetime tenure that would elevate him from a local juvenile court to the pinnacle of American jurisprudence. It was an honor that few judges would ever be offered, a chance to shape constitutional law for generations to come. When she finished, Judge Thorne was quiet for a long moment, his eyes drifting to the wall where drawings from children he had helped still hung alongside thank you letters from families whose lives had been changed by his decisions. Finally, he spoke with the same quiet dignity that had defined his response to Vance's attack. "Justice Sterling, I am deeply honored by this opportunity, but I must respectfully decline." Her eyebrows rose in surprise. "May I ask why?" Judge Thorne gestured toward the window that overlooked the courthouse steps, where a small memorial garden had been planted in Jamal Dixon's memory. "Because the work isn't finished here. Because there are still children like Lena Hayes who need someone willing to stand between them and the system's failures. Because justice isn't just about writing opinions from marble towers. Sometimes it's about staying in the trenches where the real battles are fought." Justice Sterling nodded slowly, understanding that she was witnessing something rare in Washington's power corridors, a person choosing principle over prestige. "The offer will remain open," she said as she prepared to leave, "should you ever change your mind." After she left, Judge Thorne returned to his desk, where a stack of case files awaited his review. Each one represented a family seeking protection, a child needing advocacy, a situation where his experience and commitment could make the difference between justice and injustice. The work was unglamorous, often heartbreaking, but essential in ways that appellate opinions could never be. The Vance case had resulted in convictions for 21 officers, including Vance himself, who received a 28-year federal sentence for civil rights violations and second-degree murder. Lieutenant Miller was sentenced to 18 years for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The police department underwent complete restructuring under federal oversight, with new leadership, revised training protocols, and community accountability measures that served as a model for departments nationwide. But the most lasting impact was measured not in headlines or sentences, but in the children who now walked through Vance's former patrol area without fear. Lena Hayes had returned to school with a new confidence, his experience in Judge Thorne's courtroom having taught him that speaking truth to power was not just possible, but essential. He often spoke to other students about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's scary. The memorial garden outside the courthouse had become a gathering place for families who had lost children to police violence, a space where grief could be shared and hope could be nurtured. Miss Elena Dixon tended the roses planted in her son Jamal's memory, finding peace in the knowledge that his death had not been in vain if it prevented other mothers from experiencing her pain. Sarah Jenkins had been promoted to chief court administrator, her courage in exposing Vance's crimes earning recognition throughout the legal community. She used her new position to implement transparency measures that made it impossible for future misconduct to remain hidden in administrative files. Alex Reed's coverage of the Vance case earned him a Commonwealth Prize for investigative journalism. But he was most proud of the follow-up stories that tracked the systemic changes Vance's exposure had triggered across multiple states. As evening fell over the courthouse, Judge Thorne prepared to leave for home, where his wife, Evelyn, waited, with dinner and stories of her own day saving lives as a trauma surgeon. The red mark on his cheek had long since faded, but the memory of that moment when he chose dignity over retaliation, when he let Vance's aggression expose itself rather than meeting it with aggression of his own, remained as vivid as ever. That push had indeed become the beginning of the end for a system built on silence and complicity. But more than that, it had become a reminder that sometimes the most powerful response to hostility is simply refusing to be broken by it, standing firm until truth wins, and choosing to stay where the work matters most. Justice, Judge Thorne had learned, didn't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes it just needed someone willing to absorb the blow and keep standing, letting the light shine in until darkness had nowhere left to hide. The courthouse lights dimmed as another day of seeking justice came to an end. But the work would resume tomorrow, and the day after that, and for as many days as children needed someone to stand between them and those who would abuse their power. Some battles are won not through force, but through the quiet courage of refusing to step away when stepping away would be easier. Judge Elias Thorne had chosen to stay, and in staying, had reminded an entire nation what justice looks like when it refuses to be silenced. Tune into Black Truth.